Welcome everyone here. Kaya Wanju, hello and welcome on behalf of UWA Public Policy Institute. We've got a number of people trapped in that camera, remote, so hello to them as well. I'm Shamit Saggar. I'm the director of the UWA Public Policy Institute. It's our traditional custom here at UWA to acknowledge the fact that we are meeting on the traditional land of the Noongar people. And I'd like to acknowledge that up front, but also to personally point out that it was always a traditional place of learning then, and it continues to be now. There's a sort of source of pride for the university there as well. So just to focus for a second, you're at the title was up there, the training session we're dealing with how to work with government. The Public Policy Institute, which is partnering with the Oceans Institute, is sort of sponsoring this afternoon. The Institute, PPI, was established in 2019 here at UWA. And for those of you who are not sort of versed in this, but you may have a sense of it in the background, many research-intensive universities across the world have established institutes similar to the Policy Institute. And it's part of a sort of a trend or a wave, but if only because it speaks to the point that universities have become, research-intensive universities have become very conscious of the importance of their research being transmitted, translated, and used by real-world practitioners and particularly policymakers. That's as true here as anywhere else. As a member of the group of 8, there's always a tendency, not always accurate, but there's a tendency of a stereotype to grow up. The universities can be aloof and interested in their own citations. And here at UWA, we're desperately in love, so the stereotype is, with our lawns and our footnotes. Now, however true that is, maybe to some extent, it's also the case that we need to be on the front foot and make sure that our research is used in the real world. Therefore, the Institute was established. We run a number of different activities. This is one set of things that we do, which is we deal with sort of training and awareness. But we also publish reports every year. You may have seen this, which was published last month. It's being formally launched the week after next. It's a big sort of compendium looking at WA and challenges around the economy, around people and around place. Copies at the back there. Please take a look at that. We also take some of that training that I mentioned a moment ago, and we turn it into an ongoing toolkit and guide. And that is this publication, which I think is at the back and distributed. Please take a copy. And there's even a sort of a one-page sort of toolkit on do's and don'ts. Why is all this important? Well, it's important in the context, in the sense that it's very easy for us, and I say that having spent a third of a century as an academic, it's very easy for us to fall back upon the idea that the research, in a sense, speaks for itself. The scientific method that we're all trained in thoroughly, regardless of our disciplines, is something that we're attached to early on. It's a cultural, frankly, even an emotional thing. And it's perfectly understandable and perfectly right that we then say, in order to advance knowledge, we have to sort of be very clear about what we're trying to address, the things that are in the preface and the things that follow from that. But I'd encourage us to think in terms of not either or, but to deal with real world practitioners. We've got a panel today who will be telling us more about that. It's got a lot to do with trying to meet research users and practitioners halfway, who may not know the detail and not expect to know the detail of what we do as academics, but at the same time have a very significant demand. They want to know, they want to engage, and they want to make use of that. I was at a meeting in the business school this morning where exactly that conversation was taking place with the business community, unrelated to a large part of the audience here. The demand and appetite for what we do in the knowledge industry as universities has never been greater. I think it's wonderful. You ask the Australian public, do we trust academics, scholars, and compare them with, for example, politicians, journalists, to name people they don't trust? We stand very, very high indeed, and that's good. I think it's wonderful. But we enjoy that position of strength to some extent with a degree of vulnerability if we were to take the position in relation to users of research that we're going to do this. You have to meet us on our terms and on our terms only. So this is part and parcel of trying to encourage a greater sense of this, if I can sort of use gesticulation for a second. Okay, so the objectives are to sort of deal with that. We run these sessions across campus several times a year, both with the Oceans Institute, but more generally. As I said, the written version of this is a document that we do update with typically more case studies and more examples. But one of the things we really do enjoy doing is putting people on this platform to talk to you and then giving you a chance to kind of quiz them and sort of interrogate what they've got to say. So with that in mind, we've got a cast list this afternoon. I'm going to wind up in a second. And it consists of, and I'm just going to give a very quick sense of their biography now, and we'll come back to that later on. We've got Luke Twomey, who's sitting there. You'll see him in a moment with the check shirt. He's going to come up. His day job is he's the CEO of WAMSI, the West Australian Marine Science Institute. He's also has an adjunct role here at the Oceans Institute. Whatever else WAMSI does, and he'll go into it in a second, it's very important to remember that it is sponsored and it's part and parcel of what WA government has set up. It's an institution that's designed to make the most of marine science and plug it into public policy, but also the management of our natural environment, both sort of onshore but offshore, in this case offshore. The sister organization is WABSI, which deals with biodiversity. And so you'll hear more about that. This is not something that's been sort of established by academics, it's been established as much by government, but more about that in a second. We have also, as part of a sort of double act he'll be doing, Dr. Kevin McAlpine, who is an official in government. He's a manager, Marine Ecosystems branch of the Department of Water. WER is
Environmental Regulation.
And Environmental Regulation. Sorry, I should know that. I run the Public Policy Institute. Apologies. But Kevin is going to talk a little bit about what it is to work alongside WAMSI. So you see sort of both sides of that story and more about that from them directly. We're then going to switch and hear from someone who is familiar with the research that the Institute does, but actually is much of a user and a commentator, and is going to, in a sense, give you a semi-detached, independent, outside perspective. And that's Josh Wilson, who is currently, and as we speak till the end of the Parliament, the MP for the Labour Party in Fremantle, and depending upon how the campaign goes, he may well be in that role after that. But he is, as it were, in the user space, and he'll talk a little bit about what works and what doesn't work. And then lastly, we're delighted to have Belinda Martin, Dr. Martin, and she's a research institute here at the Oceans Institute, but also with the School of Biological Sciences, and she'll take you through some of the experiences that she's had working with practitioners and research users based upon her own research. The format is you're going to hear from them one at a time, fairly brief. We'll take some Q&A. We'll break for lunch. There's such a thing as a free lunch. We'll ask you to sort of grab something, come back in, and then we'll have a further set of speakers, and we'll have a sort of group discussion at the end. But I'd really encourage you to sort of take your questions and sort of, use this opportunity to ask our panel in some degree of detail. That's it. I'm going to return to the substance in a while. Let me give way and ask Luke if he would just like to come up here and just share his thoughts. Luke. Cheers.
Great, thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Noongar Whadjuk people, elders past, present, and emerging. And look, absolutely delighted to be here to talk to you really about my day job, which is that intersect between research science and government, and to some extent industry as well. What I'll try to do today is relay some of my experience in my day job. Oh, thank you. Slides up to give you a flavour of how we understand the needs of government and how we can then bring the scientists in with very good information systems to be able to support government in what they do. I was really very excited about coming here to talk about this because I'm thinking about this all the time. I was even more excited to be able to phone a friend and bring in somebody that I work with quite closely and quite regularly, Kevin McAlpine. WAMSI has very strong relationships with a number of state government departments, all of those groups that are focused around marine science. In particular, the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation, who have really strong management and regulation responsibilities around the state, particularly when it comes to really infrastructure development, new development proposals and those sorts of things, and really providing the rules and the guidance around how development is undertaken in the state, so that you can have development, you can have economic growth and wealth, but you can do it in a method that's consistent with environmental protection and holding true to the values of the environment that you're working in. Looking across the audience today, I can see that you guys are largely undergraduate, postgraduate students, and probably maybe some postdocs in there as well. And I think it's really important for you to understand how you take what you're learning and where you're starting to focus your career, and to understand how that might apply to some of the big gnarly problems that are facing government or may face government into the future. So that's, hopefully we can kind of land on that today, and you can ask some questions of us, those of us that work in that area. So I've talked a little bit about DWER. There's also DWER, which is the Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development, and they look after the Fisheries Department in Western Australia. They are resource managers largely. There's also the Department of Biodiversity and Conservation and Attractions, who are really responsible for managing the marine estate, marine parks, marine park planning, development of new marine parks, looking after iconic species. And they are huge digesters of scientific information. They have a number of marine scientists on their staff as well. So that's another area that you could feed information into. The other area that we work in and try to bring scientific information into the fold is around providing advice into state government ministers. So those decision makers who are making some pretty hard decisions at times, and often in a vacuum of information. So they require good hard science to help them make decisions. And where they don't have that, it's really very difficult. So they look to groups like WOMSI and WOBSI and other institutes around the place for that information. And then, of course, there's policies, state government policies that deal with development or deal with management, and how the science can inform those policies and potentially affect change over time, where we start to get new information that can change the way that we do things and make it more efficient, better, more effective. And then, of course, there's WA government in terms of infrastructure development, and some of the areas that WAMSI has been very active in recent years has been around infrastructure development for Northwest Shelf, around dredging in particular, and how we deal with dredging into the future. And then most recently around the Westport port development in Coburn Sound, which is a huge piece of science that has been provided, big budget provided to WOMSI to fill in a whole bunch of black boxes in Coburn Sound, so that if a port does go ahead, we've got a really good, strong science baseline with which to make good informed decisions as we go down the track. And then there's a bunch of government kind of infrastructure departments that we can feed information into as well. So there's groups like Water Corporation, Department of Transport, which are responsible for safe navigation and channels, dredging, shipping, all of those things. And then we can also provide advice into future developments and strategic planning through groups like JETSI, Department of Jobs, Tourism, Science and Innovation. So we work across a whole bunch of things. But your responsibility as scientists is to provide that really strong scientific-based information into decision making. And that's where WOMSI comes into play, because we provide the conduit with which to do that. So I've kind of leapt ahead a little bit. So I've only got a few slides, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about WOMSI. I'm going to ask Kevin to talk to us about how scientists and WA government can work together. We're going to talk about a couple of examples, and then I'm going to end up with a bit of a commentary around how you might think about working with government in your own profession. So the WOMSI sits in that space between research science and state government, and to some extent industry as well, where there are industry needs for science, we can facilitate that as well. We're a strange organisation. We're a partnership, we're a collaborative research institute. So we've got all of those government departments, West Australian government departments that have marine scientists on their staff. We have the WA Museum the Chem Centre. Let me not forget anybody. We've got the Australian Institute of Marine Sciences as our Commonwealth partner in here as well. And of course, we've got all of the universities. So we've got Curtin, Murdoch, ECU, and UWA within our partnership. So it was formed to be able to provide baseline information into decision support for a couple of really big programs to begin with. The first one was around the Ningaloo, and we called it the Ningaloo Research Node. And it was back in the mid-2000s, and it was a big $20 million plus program to provide all of that new baseline information around habitat mapping, etc. We've been around for 17 years, where we've really kind of become a support mechanism for state government when they need to make big decisions around big ports or those kind of things. And what I might do now is because we don't have a whole lot of time, I might flick over to Kevin. Kevin, can you hear me okay? And are you able to provide some commentary around scientists and WA government working together?
Sure, thanks, Luke. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Loud and clear, okay. I guess as already mentioned, DWER's main role is as an environmental and water regulator in the state. And the regulatory functions cover most aspects of the environment, water, air, noise, biological communities, greenhouse gas emissions, the whole gambit. And to be able to achieve that, we need to be able to provide a strong science understanding and input to regulation. And the role of my group, the Marine Ecosystems branch, is really to provide that science advice to the regulatory arms of DWER, and also to develop, science-based policy and guidance to assist the regulators and also to assist developers within the state. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, government reform over the last 10 to 20 years has reduced the number of scientists doing research within government. There's still some research done within government to support regulation and other decision making, but much less. And our group, for example, we were 12 or more people undertaking quite major research programs about 20 to 30 years ago. Now we're down to 2, just gone up to 3. So our role is no longer undertaking science and research, but rather it's being abreast of the current science, interpreting it, and then being able to apply it to regulation and, as I said, policy development and development guidance. And we are very reliant on research providers to provide the information that we need. And the position that we're in, between the regulation or the decision making and the science itself, means we're in a unique spot. We can identify, we can see where the knowledge gaps are that need to be filled and where the risks to the environment are. So we don't have the ability to do the research, which means we rely on research providers, and WAMSI is really ideally placed to address a lot of these information gaps, given it's situated between government and research. It has partners, both government partners and research partners sitting on WAMSI. So we engage quite closely with WAMSI to explore opportunities to undertake research to fill some of these information gaps. Within DWER, we don't have a lot of money to do it, so we have to look at alternative opportunities to find the funding to actually do a lot of the research to fill our gaps. But science is very important, has a very important role in regulation within government and within DWER. Shall I leave it at that, Luke? Or
yeah, that's good, Kevin. I think that's really good, because it then focuses the attention back on the research institutions and the universities. So what Kevin's basically demonstrated is that we've lost capacity within state government in the marine space to actually do their own research. So they're now looking at service providers. The most service providers are you guys and the other research institutes, or commercial providers. So the consultants that are out there as well. but there's a big difference in the quality of science that you get between those two different groups. And of course, the research scientists are very strong in very good experimental design, at very good science, at taking the time to set up those sorts of scientific programs. Whereas the commercial side is kind of driven by timelines and deliverables, so they're not able to follow the same level of rigor. So, you know, a strong and growing role for research scientists to be able to provide that support interstate. So look, Kevin and I have picked out 3 examples of projects that we've worked with. One that was in the past, one that's current, and one that's a future issue. Kevin and I worked quite closely on the Dredging Science Note, which was a really big program that was sponsored by offsets from the very large Gorgon project and Woodside projects and DHB projects up on the Northwest Shelf. And it was really looking at the pressure response relationship between dredging and turbidity and the response on the marine environment. And it was very deliberately set up so that the science worked hand in hand with regulation, because what we were finding was the regulators were being asked questions about dredging and they didn't have the science to support answers. So they were having to be very, very conservative in their approach to dredging, which meant that they had huge areas that they needed to monitor. They needed to monitor basically everything in the marine environment to understand whether there was a pressure and a response on those things. And through the science program, we're able to refine the types of indicators that we use to really bring it down to the ones that I guess exhibited the greatest response to those pressures. And what that enabled us to do was actually bring that information back to the regulator and rewrite the advice. And Kevin, that's I guess was your role in that project, where you took the marine science and rewrote the guidelines.
Yeah, that's right. I'm just wondering if it's worth mentioning that that through the assessment and regulation of 4 large dredging programs, you know, it was quite obvious that there was a lack of information on what the important dredging related pressures were and what the impact was on biota. And so the EPA required the proponents of these big dredging programs to provide funding to do the research to better understand the impacts of dredging on marine biota and be able to better predict impact. So the Dredging Science Note was born from a requirement for proponents to provide funding to actually improve our understanding of the impacts. And the EPA, when assessing dredging projects, because there was so little information available on potential impacts and to provide reasonably accurate impact predictions, the EPA had a framework that it developed that expected proponents to use when presenting their data, that took into account the uncertainty around impact prediction, and the uncertainty was very large. So the work that needed to be done by WAMSI to improve our understanding also needed to fit within the regulatory framework that the EPA had. And so DWER, as Luke said, DWER was a key contributor to the oversight of the dredging program to make sure that the outputs were going to be fit for purpose for regulation. And they were. It was a very successful program, $20 million program, I think, Luke. And last year, the EPA was able to update that guidance that contained the framework around, uncertainty, presenting uncertainty, and incorporate a lot of the outputs from the WAMSI program, particularly in relation to the key pressure indicators of dredging on marine biota and the thresholds of acceptable change in those indicators. So that the impacts the predicted impacts have a much smaller uncertainty associated with them. And that has led to I guess, a reduced focus or a less comprehensive monitoring program being required of proponents in the past, and it's meant that the compliance has been a little bit easier.
Yeah, that's the way I see it. It's kind of a better environmental outcome because we know what to look for, but it becomes a more efficient thing for industry to run as well over time because they're not having to spend vast quantities of money looking at everything anymore. They can look at those particular sectors that need to be looked at.
Yeah, so tighter prediction and more focused monitoring.
Yeah, we're running out of time pretty rapidly. I was given the 5-minute time 2 minutes ago, so might move on to Westport. And Westport was really it's a current program. It's a $13.5 million program that WOMSI has reached out to its partners and built into a $20 million program through in-kind investment, and that is really around providing new contemporary information to support the Westport program, determine whether they can put a port there or not, and in doing so, what are the things that are likely to be impacted, and how can we mitigate some of those pressures if they do develop a new port to making environmental improvements in that system and maintain the values of that system over time. Probably won't go into that one much more, given we've got 2 minutes. But Kevin, perhaps we can talk about the Pilbara Coast and kind of future programs in that area. And I guess the area between Exmouth Gulf and moving north up to Karratha has become a really interesting area for development pressure of late. And it's all around salt mines and solar salt projects and potash projects, which are related. There's one project that's been approved. There are 2 that are in the approval process, and there's a number of others that are in development at the moment. So we've got this logjam of projects in an area of very remote Western Australian coastline that we know very little about. And the EPA is trying to make decisions about whether these projects should go ahead or not. And so we are in a position now where they really need the scientific support to be able to help them make good decisions about this area of land. So the very first project that went through is for Marty Salt, and associated with that is an environmental offset, which is a $2.5 million research investment that WAMSI is managing. And we're going to use that to start to fill in some of those black boxes around what are the communities in those areas, what's their ecological function, and how will they react over a changing climate. And so you can see there's absolute synergies between government needs and marine scientists' input. Kevin, did you have anything else to add to the Pilbara Coast stuff?
Just that, each of these solar salt proposals, they're huge. We're talking about between 100 and 200 square kilometres of area that they take up with their ponds and their other infrastructure, and most of it's located within the intertidal zone. And so we're talking about mangrove communities, but they generally try to avoid mangroves as much as they can, but there's still going to be flow-on impacts to mangroves. There's a lot of algal mat communities up there, and then there's samphire. They're the 3 main communities being affected. But very non-sexy subjects, not a lot of research that's been done, not a lot of information. And the EPA these days, as with change in legislation, now needs to not just consider the impacts of individual proposals, but the cumulative impact of multiple proposals in a region. And so with 4 or 5 more of these salt farms coming on in the West Pilbara, on top of the 2 or 3 that are already existing up there, means that a substantial portion of the intertidal habitats is going to be taken up. And as Luke was saying, what are the long-term consequences of that? We don't know what their role and function is, what their connectivity is to the subtidal marine environment. We don't even have maps of most of the distribution of most of those communities. Mangroves, yes, but algal mats and samphire, no. So yeah, there's a need for a lot of information to be collected there to help the EPA consider the cumulative impacts of these things and determine what might or might not be acceptable.
So one of the roles that we play in a situation like that is to provide information into the Minister for the Environment and to the Minister for Regional Development and State Development to say, hey, look, we can see a problem. We know that you're trying to make decisions about this. We know the science isn't available. We suggest that you put a strategic research program together and get this information as quickly as possible. And we go through the process of taking that to government and really promoting that hard for the marine scientists. Doesn't always fall well. We don't always get the decisions that we want, but you know, we use, I guess, different lines of evidence to try to build a good case and as good a case as possible to get the stuff to work. So we've gone well and truly over.
You're fine.
Okay. What I did want to just very quickly talk about is how you can consider working with government. And really there's I guess there's two ways. There's directly and indirectly. Directly through getting a job with government and having a fantastic career like Kevin's had, providing, you know, excellent advice into the state government and keeping industries honest and making sure that the conservation of the marine estate is well and truly looked after and regulated well. And there's many other types of jobs that I'm sure you're familiar with in the government system. But then I think it's more of the, I guess, the indirect pressure through the careers that you're choosing now and how you align your specialty areas, which I'm sure you're carving out now, and becoming experts in those particular areas. How that information can then be, I guess, communicated in a way that government can understand, that the people in the government jobs can chew on and understand and build into policy. So I think that's, you know, probably the area where you'll interact mostly with the West Australian government and into the federal government as well. There are also a number of opportunities in the same vein. So I'm very happy to talk to you more about that in question time, I think. I might shut up and sit down and take some questions for Kevin and I.
So thank you, Luke. And we're going to pause for lunch. Are there any immediate questions you'd like to put to Luke or Kevin at this stage, whilst it's fresh in your mind? You've got them right here.
This is the microphone. I will be bringing it to you.
Okay. If I'm going to indulge the role of the chair, I'm just going to ask one quick question, and both of you can answer it individually or one of you. There's a theme in what you're saying, which is that on the one hand, research scientists are kind of brought up on a diet of curiosity-led research, right? On the other hand, there's an agenda around problem-driven research. There are gaps in knowledge. You made the point yourself, a number of things that simply not known, huge gaps in knowledge. And you're trying to feed that in order to inform, frankly, ultimately educate ministers, okay? How do you strike a balance between those two things?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I chose that very early in my career, I decided that I wanted my marine science to be applied marine science that would be used by management. So I'm a phytoplankton ecologist. I used to look at algal blooms and nutrient pollution in estuaries. And I was really concerned that we were seeing this flip from quite reasonable quality estuaries to eutrophic systems. And I wanted to change that. And I saw the scientific process as being a way to do that. So I think there is a choice in there, but as my career has progressed and I spent years as a marine consultant as well, I've seen how some people can get involved in directing government decision and doing applied science, even though that's not necessarily what their choice is. So, you know, you might be a brilliant fish ecologist, but all of a sudden, you know, we really need to know about blue-spotted emperor off the Pilbara coast because it's an important economic resource that's likely to be impacted by salt farms. So your skills will be called on, whether you like it or not, in some cases. Kevin, did you have any comments?
Look, obviously, I can see the value of going down both pathways, but for me, obviously, the applied sciences, you know, that has a useful, you know, fit for purpose outcome for decision making is what we're looking at. But sometimes the more following your dream sort of science comes up with some amazing new information that we just didn't know, and can be quite important too. But I guess, yeah, it's a interesting balance, isn't it? It's hard to know. For me, applied science is probably, well, that's what I'm looking for anyway.
And sometimes you might not have a choice as well. You know, you kind of come out at the end of your PhD and you're really well qualified, you're an expert in that area, but there's no practical application for it. So you're left with a choice of answering telephones or adapting your science. That's where I was, certainly in my career. You know, I got to the end of my PhD and I was a very well-educated phytoplankton ecologist with not many opportunities. So, you know, I had to learn and adapt and pick up skills in other areas.
So let's move on. Time is short, okay? So in another world, far removed from here, in that building that's on the front of that publication I mentioned, the Federal Parliament in Canberra, Josh Wilson, MP, spends a lot of his time. And I'm delighted, first of all, to welcome him to this session. Just to reinforce the point, there's so much science and scientific sort of knowledge and commitment in this room, in this building, on this campus, of which there can be no doubt. The issue really is a question of whether or not it can be put into the hands of those who are going to make rather big decisions about the marine science space or the environment more generally. And when you work in politics and when you work in public policy, one of the things you'll obviously know very, very clearly or discover very quickly is that it's a very time-poor world. People want to get to the essence of something. And that can be debated as a good and bad thing. Very quick, one little anecdote to share with you before I ask Josh to come up here. If you survey the current generation of PhDs in Australian universities compared with the generation that did their PhDs when I was sort of in your position, you notice one important difference. When asked, overwhelmingly, they report that the reason why they're doing advanced research is in order to make a difference. They actually see their research and research commitment as part and parcel of making that difference. That could be in your field, it could be in other fields that are represented across this campus. But it's unmistakable that people see, the younger scholars see this as part and parcel of what they want to achieve. They don't see it necessarily in opposition to making a big splash as a scholar. They see it as well as, and it's a very subtle but important message. And it's an important message that will transmit through universities, which for the most part, in the last 10 or 20 years, have been focused and incentivized upon producing scholars as an end in itself, you know, peer-reviewed journals. It's an important point. Now, Josh is from this other world, which has a great deal of demand and appetite for what we're producing. But we want to hear about what it's like actually to sort of transact with researchers. Josh, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shamit, and it's lovely to be here at UWA. I acknowledge that we are on the land of the Whadjuk Noongar people. I was a student at UWA in the 90s for 5 years, and my daughter's studying here now. So I love coming back just to this physical world. It's a lot of good memories for me, the bits that I can remember. But look, I'm going to speak pretty informally and briefly with you, and really, as Shamit said, I'm here just as an example of you know, I'm like a if you're working in the area of penguin science, in a way, I'm like a penguin. I'm a politician, and I hope that some of you will connect with people like me, because we need that. You know, government. On behalf of the broader community and the global community, government needs and that the community needs what you do and what you will do and what you know and what you will know and learn. And so to some degree, I'm just going to give you my kind of perspective of what it's like as someone who does hear from scientists and researchers and what it means to me, and give you a few tips that I hope will be helpful to you as you develop that part of your work. I've worked in politics for 20 years. I've worked as a staff member, worked in local government. I'm now a member of federal parliament, and I'm the Shadow Assistant Minister for the Environment. So, you know, part of my work, I have some responsibility within Labor's environment team for oceans. So part of my responsibility has been looking at ocean policy, and I've already benefited from people who work in this building who helped wake me up to a few things. And I guess I'll use that as some examples. You know, it's really important that scientists share the substance of their work, but going back to something that Shamit talked about, it's also really important, I would say, that you help to continue to educate all of us about the scientific method. I think we've all seen in recent times, whether it's a topic like climate change or whether it's a topic like pandemic management, that the actual sort of deeper understanding of what the scientific method is all about is not as good as it could be. And it's an irony that in the age of the internet, that there's actually a huge amount of stuff swirling around out there that's almost misleading people about what science really does. And as soon as people think that science is just about, you know, whether or not something is absolutely true or absolutely false. So as soon as there's something in a scientific conversation that doesn't look like it's absolutely true, well then in their mind, it doesn't mean anything. You know, we've seen that a lot, I think, particularly around the pandemic, and that's a problem. You know, people don't really understand what the scientific method is about and how it progresses over time and how that evaluative, testing, predictive part of science actually occurs and why it's so valuable. So I'm really going to try and leave you with 5 points. The first and foremost is what you do is really important, really, really important. Never forget that. Don't ever, if you encounter someone like me or someone in the political world, a bureaucrat or an advisor, and you get the vibe off them that what you do isn't significant, they're wrong. Don't be disheartened or demoralised by that. Connect up with your friends. You know, gather your sort of your energy and your sense of purpose and go again, because we need to keep breaking down that barrier, and decision makers and public policy makers and regulators and funders need to get more information, expertise and guidance from scientists and from science. The second thing I would say, which is almost like a book review, I guess, is that this is really good. So sometimes, you know, an institute will produce something like this. I mean, I read a lot of these kinds of things, and some of them are better than others. This is good, right? I read this and I thought, wow, I wish more people who came to see me had read something like this first. So if you haven't really come to grips with it, I'd encourage you to do that. And also, you know, like, this is a version of a document. I dare say this will evolve. You know, you in your experience may have contributions to make to something like this as you go on. The do's and don'ts on page 13 are spot on. The section about outlining the range of ways that you can feed into policy making is also really important. I'm the deputy chair of the Energy and Environment Committee. We've held inquiries in this term of Parliament on topics as various as the prerequisites for a civilian nuclear energy industry in Australia and the harm and management of feral cats. Now, the opportunity for any member of the community to make a submission to a federal parliamentary inquiry is there, and having made a submission to then seek to come and participate in an inquiry hearing. In normal times, pre and hopefully post-COVID, those committees will literally try and visit at the federal level, will try and visit every capital city, and they'll hold a hearing on that inquiry topic. And if a person has made a submission and then seeks to be heard at the inquiry, they'll get that opportunity. I'd encourage you to try that. Like, nobody, I mean, we get, people make submissions from, you know, charming, well-intentioned 76-year-olds who live in the country somewhere, write a submission about feral cats. Why not? You know, it comes from their perspective and their point of view. So if you've got something to offer with those inquiries, put in a submission. It can be 1 page, it could be 10 pages. And then if it's at the 10-page end and you've really got something to say, seek to appear before the committee. It's not only a useful way of getting stuff on the record and influencing what will ultimately be a committee report, it's also just, I would say, good professional development. Like writing that, you know, it's different to writing a journal piece. It might be similar to a piece that you're going to publish in a peer-reviewed journal. It might become a piece you're going to publish in a peer-reviewed journal. It's different to an op-ed. It's another kind of writing and another kind of storytelling, persuasive text that you will learn by writing. And appearing before a committee, it's a weird experience. Like you'll literally be there and there'll be a similar camera or thing like this and it's broadcast live and there'll be committee people and they'll say, well, thanks for coming. We'll ask you some serious questions and some of them won't quite like what you've got to say and others will be really keen and it's feels a bit weird, like a TV, but you'll learn from it. You'll learn from that experience. You'll be challenged and you'll contribute to it. I encourage you to do that. I'd also add to one of the things that's probably not mentioned here is that political parties in their policy process have at the state and federal level, party structure, they have a party platform. If you've got an area of interest and you think that policy should shift in some direction, go and have a look at the platform of the Liberal Party, platform of the Labor Party, platform of the Greens. You might find that there's already commitment in an area that you think is interesting or not. Now, if there isn't and you think there should be, there'll be a policy committee within that party structure. You can ask to provide something to that policy committee. All political parties have annual conferences. If you and a couple of scientific friends want to offer up a seminar as part of that conference, all our conferences have different seminars from different interest groups where all they're really seeking to do is engage with party members and educate them about a topic. You can do that. It's right down almost at that ground level of kind of policy development that sort of has the potential to filter up into a party platform, into a campaign commitment, into government, into regulation, a funding commitment or whatever. So I encourage you to think about that. The third point I'd make is take an interest in politics and policy making. Scientists are stereotyped. People watch, what's that? Big Bang Theory. People think scientists are all from Big Bang Theory. People think politicians are all from the thick of it or vegan. The jokes are not that good, I can tell you. There's not as much swearing as you would have, but understand the world of politics and government. Put a little bit of time into that. That will help you be effective. I do still get people who come to see me from industry, fairly high-level professionals, who in the course of presenting to me, it becomes clear that they don't really understand the difference even between opposition and government. Or they don't really understand the difference between the relevant jurisdictional responsibilities of state and federal government. And that's, if you end up in a meeting with someone and you haven't done that kind of background, you're not helping yourself. Remember that people in my position are not the only part of, sometimes there's a view that if you're not talking to the shadow minister or the minister or the member of parliament, you're wasting your time. That's a mistake. Okay. Sometimes when I was an advisor, I used to occasionally be asked to meet with someone that my boss, the then minister, couldn't meet with. And that person would sometimes say to me, look, I want to meet with the chief, not the Indians. Now, not only is that a pretty bad form of cultural misappropriation, but it's also just stupid. Like, if you think that a rushed 10 minutes with me is better than an hour with Joseph, my chief of staff, you're not thinking. People, the advisors, I'm the tip of the spear of a group of people that are all working together. And if you get time with someone who's advising me and you convince them of the importance of what you're talking about, you're there. You convince Joseph, it's very, very rare that he's not going to convince me. So understand how that kind of world works and be prepared to be flexible in terms of how you engage with decision makers and their teams. Also remember that, funnily enough, it's a bad habit of politicians. If a politician is meeting with you, one of the strange imperatives that politicians feel is that they need to show you that they know what you're talking about. So sometimes I feel like people come to see me and they're thinking, well, this guy's the shadow minister for the environment, so he must know what he's talking about. And I wake up feeling that too. So sometimes, rather than really listening to you, I spend my time trying to impress you because I've hastily read something. And so if you're able to put the person you're dealing with at ease and almost ask them, say, listen, forgive me, I'm going to explain this to you in the same way I explain it to my son, or the same way I explain it to my best friend at a dinner party who doesn't give a crap about science. If you put them at ease, they will stop trying to impress you and they will listen to what you have to say. And And that really helps. I knew a minister who had a lot of confidence, was a very relaxed guy, and he would actually start his meetings by inviting people to he'd say, talk to me as if I'm a child. And please understand at the outset that I'm going to ask some stupid questions because I really don't know what your area of expertise. But I'm going to do that so that I can help understand what it is that you're on about. So I think that's a piece of advice I would give you. So that's about people understanding politics, understanding what people like me, our headspace. The fourth point I'd make is about presenting your message. And the best thing I would give you to hold on to is that it's a kind of concept from journalism, the sort of the inverted pyramid. So really start with your headline, and then a tiny amount of elaboration, and then, if required, a bit of context and some further detail. Do not come at it the other way. Do not start the conversation by saying, hi, I'm from the so-and-so institute. You might know that that institute started in 1991. The first professor who started it was so-and-so. Now, I came there 7 years ago, and first of all, I did this, and then I did this. Do not do that. Come in and say, not enough people know about the Great Southern Reef. We all talk about the Great Barrier Reef too much. The Great Southern Reef is under enormous pressure. Some of my work can help government make decisions that will significantly improve biodiversity. Bang. And then I've been working on it for 2 years. What we found out is this, this, and this. And then I already know you have this program. I already know there's money that's unspent over the next few years. With just this little bit more money, we can do a bit more of that. And I think we can turn this into something that will make a difference. You know, it's got to be like that. That will cut through. Finally, number 5. This is just my my grab bag of general imperatives. You know, be patient, be persistent. Don't put it all on that one engagement with a decision maker. Know that sometimes that will go amazingly well, but sometimes you need to kind of knock on the door a few times. Sometimes you can have that time. You might be lucky. First, you get straight to the minister. It's a great idea then to say, as one of your asks, like always be clear about what it is that you want. Are you there to educate them? Are you there to try and persuade them? Is there something particularly that you need? Don't only have one ask, you know, have your highest ask. We'd love money for this. We can't have money for this. Would you consider a bit less money for a review? You know, one of the things you should always do in that situation is you've got the meeting with whoever the decision maker is. One of the asks is, can we come back and talk to your chief of staff for an hour in 2 weeks' time? You know, build on that engagement so that you have the opportunity to affect something incrementally over time. Be opportunistic. You'll know this anyway. I think it's true in every area of professional life. Sometimes the tide is running with you and you can make a lot of progress. Sometimes it's not. You need to just tread water and wait. But when something presents, an opportunity presents, something happens out there in the big world, and you know that government is awake, then be ready to engage. And do what you can to sort of join the dots. Like, it can be a bit radial. You can have decision makers at the hub, and you can have, you know, as Luke's talked about, you can have academia, industry, community groups around the wheel, and then they're not talking to each other. They're just relating to the hub. You know, make sure that you connect up, because the more people that are sharing information, having the same conversation, that conversation then becomes a story, it becomes a narrative of change that you want to see. And I guess I'll just finish by trying to pick up one of the things that Luke was asked, that balance in the science between applied science and pure science. I mean, I think it's true that most of the time people who are engaging with decision makers are coming with some applied science. That will be the case. One thing I would just say is, you will all know, anyone working in applied science knows that some of the scientific knowledge that they are using was probably derived by work that someone was doing in a pure field. So tell that story. If you're coming with something that has an application that government's going to be interested in because it fixes a particular problem, has an economic benefit, but you know that's only possible because someone else just decided, you know what, I just love algae and I just want to spend all this time looking at algae. I don't know what for, I just love it. And if it's part of what they did that gives you the knowledge that turns into this application. Tell that story, because we all need to know. You know, it's really hard. Like, government can be persuaded all the time. If you're asked, like, I've got 2 pots of $1 million, and I can put them both into these applied projects that are going to solve an existing problem, or I can put one into an applied problem, and I can put another into just pure research for just people to do maths or do whatever. You know, it's really tempting. The gravitational pull towards that kind of problem-solving approach is pretty strong. So you need, you know, we need particularly people who know why pure science is so important. You need to try and tell that story on behalf of your colleagues. Some of you might be pure scientists here anyway, but you need to tell that story on behalf of your colleagues. This is a piece of work that Minderoo did. The Global Fishing Index. They went and gathered all sorts of research about the state of fisheries around the world. They looked at the national management of fisheries according to the Sustainable Development Goals. They came and met with me. They gave me it. They talked me through it. Very well put together piece of research. And they said, you know what? Australia imports 70% of the seafood we consume. More than half of it comes from fisheries that you couldn't even say they're poorly managed. They're not managed, right? And yet Australia has no mechanism for looking at the traceability of imported seafood. So we've got 70% of the seafood we consume. A very big bit of that is coming from fisheries with terrible fisheries practices, no environmental regulation, no data capture or reporting, awful workplace safety and other kind of forms of modern slavery. Terrible. The European Union has a framework to combat illegal, unreported and unregulated fisheries. And that's, they control imports of seafood on that basis. Surprisingly, I mean, it doesn't surprise me that the EU does. Almost every area of life, the EU is a regulatory step ahead of us. It does surprise me that the United States also has one. Does Australia have one? No. I didn't know that until I saw this. And as a result of that, I've incorporated that idea that Australia should look to develop an IUU regulatory framework going forward. So it's on my policy list. And if the Labor government is elected, it'll be one of the things that I would hope. But it's one of those areas that I hope we would fix, and by doing that, make a contribution to better management of fisheries and a better environment. So anyway, good on you for what you're doing. Keep doing it, and I hope to cross paths with some of you in the future.
Thank you, Josh. I mean, I could certainly sit here and listen to you all day. It's fascinating. The series of kind of tales from the front line, and you've probably got some scars if you sort of roll up your sleeves. Enough from me. You must have some questions you'd like to put to Josh. Would you like to do that? Anyone want to jump in?
I should say also, actually, Darren is here. Darren was connected. I participate in something called Science Meets Parliament,
yeah.
which kind of every year connects parliamentarians up with 3 early career scientists. And I spoke with some guys. One of the things we talked about was the Antarctic environment and Australia's Antarctic environment, how we manage stations there. And through that, I was referred to Darren, who of course doesn't live that far away from my office. And Darren went down to Antarctica and did some work specifically on contaminants in the Antarctic environment that are caused by the occupation of the various bases. Most of the worst of it probably by other countries that have bases in our territory. But it was just another example of that, how you can connect up with people and learn. So
great. Yeah. Please go ahead. There's a microphone so people online can hear as well. If you want to say who you are.
Yeah, okay. Hi, thanks so much, Josh. I'm Leah Beasley, a mid-career researcher. It's fascinating listening to you. There's a bit of a perception or perhaps a misconception among younger scientists that there are too many doors and too many gatekeepers for us to be able to connect with people like you. So it was really interesting to hear that you're sort of saying your staffers and even sometimes yourself are open to talk with researchers about some of these important environmental issues. I thought there was no way that would be able to happen for younger researchers.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously I'm sort of speaking for myself. I wouldn't pretend that every single member of Parliament is necessarily as sort of interested in that as I am, but I think it's a lot more accessible than people would perceive, and it is that perception thing that people, you know, I often say in the areas that I'm responsible for, oceans, heritage, and recycling, I just know that there will be people sometimes that think, oh, well, I'd like to raise this with this particular person, the Shadow Assistant Minister, or whoever it happens to be, but I've never done that before, and I guess I'd have to write some sort of fairly formal letter, and I thought about it, and I've started a draft, and then I got caught up doing other things. And I mean, one of the things I always say in my stakeholder engagement is, particularly with people who work in the recycling and resource management industry, just open an email and write, "G'day, Josh, met you the other day. I just wanted to bring the following to your attention, ... Regards, Sarah." You know, I mean, that's, we can't allow those sort of formalities, I think, to stop people from connecting. It doesn't mean, you know, I do get emails. Wouldn't want anyone here to think that every time someone emails me and says, "I've got something fascinating to tell you, I can't explain what it is, but I'd love to sit down with you for an hour next week." I mean, I don't take those meetings all that often. I have to say to you, you know, of course, there's a bit of a process of saying, "So who are you? What is it about? Can you tell us a bit more?" But yeah, and to the extent that the person is meeting me halfway, like they say, "I know that this is your role. You've got some responsibility for oceans, and I'm in the ocean science space, and I think this is something you should hear." Well, of course, that's true, and I should. So.
One more hand.
Thanks, Josh. That was really helpful. I'm Anna Monera, and I'm a postdoc at the School of Agriculture and Environment. I wanted to ask you, there's two countries that I know of, Peru and New Zealand, that have national environmental protection laws that specifically protect surf breaks. Do you think that something like that could ever happen in Australia or in WA?
How do they protect surf breaks? Like, in what do you mean?
So when there's so for example, when there's a development project, like where it is for the water quality, a wastewater treatment plant, or an offshore platform that would impact the break and it would affect the quality of the wave, that is protected under statutory laws in New Zealand and Peru and these other countries that are doing that too. Do you? This is something that I'm particularly interested in. I was wondering whether you think there's something that.
I mean, I don't see why not. You know, most of surf breaks will be in state waters, so you know it'll be a state regulatory matter. But you know, to the extent that I have a friend, a coastal engineer, and his kind of work is with local governments dealing with ocean morphology and the sort of coastal impacts of various different things. It's usually, I mean, in Fremantle we have big problems with that because of North Quay is a lot of reclaimed land, and so that the coast there is artificial anyway, and we're seeing these now very severe erosion problems. And at the moment, you know, we deal with those very crudely. We build another breakwater, we truck lots of sand from somewhere to somewhere else, and maybe ultimately we build an ocean wall or something, and we can't save the beach. But I can tell you, if you know, if there was a really significant surf break that was at risk of something like that, I think there would be a strong community interest in it. It's a fascinating thing to protect something that is, you know, is ephemeral. It's a form of ocean kinetic action that could be harmed by something. Yeah, I hadn't thought of it, but I think there'd be a lot of popular support for it, that's for sure.
Thank you. Thanks, Josh.
Any last questions? One last one. I just want to reinforce something that Josh had halfway through his presentation. So it's not just about his email box being open the way which he described. You mentioned parliamentary committees, both standing committees and select committees. Again, they're mentioned in that guide. And this is part and parcel of academics, the research community, taking more effort to learn a little bit about the policy process and making these distinctions that people don't really know about, but understandable. My main point is that these committees in Parliament themselves are places where you can pitch, where you can approach. They have a secretariat, they have a bureaucracy whose job it is to make sure that when they run these inquiries, there's as broad consultation as possible. So it's not just putting all your eggs in one basket. There are these committees whose job it is to sort of hear from you or hear from groups of researchers. All that is available for you to do.
And I think it's right, Joe will correct me, but I think it's true that you can essentially go through the committee network at the federal and state levels, identify the committees that are likely to have some, obviously energy and environment would be relevant to everyone in this room, but there are other committees that you'd select as well. And you can then essentially receive alerts from the committee. So just sign up for the alerts, and then you will get an email whenever a committee initiates a new inquiry. You'll get an email saying, we've just started this inquiry. I'm also on the treaties committee, and the treaties committee handles all of our international agreements. So not just ones we're entering into for the first time, but agreements that are constantly being updated, like CITES and a range of them that are also in the ocean space. Every single time there are amendments that need to be considered, that triggers off part of that committee process. And so it's not hard to do. You could take 1 hour and you'd set yourself up with a series of alerts that would just tell you a committee has decided to look at something, and you'd be like, my God, that's exactly in my area. And then, when does the submission date close? 3 weeks' time, no problem. And make a contribution. I'd encourage you to do it.
Thanks, Josh. So on that note, I'm going to ask Belinda to come up. Belinda Martin, mentioned her earlier on as part of the panel. She's an associate here at the Institute and also in the School of Biological Sciences. One of the things that Belinda does is spend a lot of time with natural resource managers, people who are trying to make sense of some of this decision-making processes. I'm going to hand over to her directly, who's going to unpack some of what that looks like in practice. I'm sure very lively session. There'll be some questions that come out of that. Belinda.
Thanks. There is a good surf break at Port Beach, actually. Doesn't break all the time, but yeah. Yeah. All right. So where would I be about a discussion with government engagement without a bunch of stock imagery of people shaking hands with each other to inspire everybody? I'm definitely not an expert in this space at all. All I can do for the next 10 minutes or so is talk about my own experience of working with government, and that is from the perspective of an early career researcher. So I think we've already kind of covered why people would want to engage with government and industry more generally. So I'm just going to talk to why I personally work with government, and I'm going to talk about seagrass because that's what I always talk about, as many of you would know. A study came out about last year talking about the catastrophic seagrass loss that's happened across the United Kingdom. And that was about 44% of their seagrass across the UK has been lost, which does sound like a pretty catastrophic problem. But as many of you might know already in this room, the situation in Australia is also catastrophic. I think those numbers kind of speak to themselves. And, these are crude estimates because we really don't know how much is out there, of course, as well. Of course, we have a larger amount of coastline in Australia, so we have more to protect, we have more to lose, and we have less money available to try and prevent further losses. And of course, that's just because of population differences. And I think we kind of touched on this before as well. I think Kevin even said he went from a staff of, 12 to 2? Yeah, so I think from my perspective, I see this as well, that there is a greater reliance on academic researchers to kind of come in and help government in whatever monitoring and management and regulation things that they have going on. And that's where I've mostly worked in this space as well. So yeah, that's about seagrasses, but I think there's ecosystems all across Australia, both marine and terrestrial, that are in dire need of our help. And there's just not enough of us. I don't think we can work as isolated groups anymore. I really do think we need to work together more, and we need to work together more effectively. And I guess that's my kind of ethical reasons for wanting to work with government. But of course, I also need a salary. As an early career researcher, like probably predominantly most early career researchers, my salary needs to come from outside of the university. I'm not teaching staff. And that can feel like you don't have any job stability at all. A survey from early career researchers in Australia that was published last year shows that the majority of early career researchers are in my position. That is, that we're all research only. I think I think instead of asking why they want to go into academia, I'm going from it the opposite direction, is why do they want to leave? And the most common answer is inadequate job security. The second is a lack of funding. And of course, those two things are tied together. So it's also out of necessity. We also need to find money to continue to do the things that we think are important. But there's not a whole bunch of money out there. And I think what that also has been touched on in previous talks as well is that it means that you can't maybe be as specialized as you once were. So I predominantly used to work on seagrass ecosystems. I still do, but now I work on everything. I work on freshwater wetlands, constructed wetlands, freshwater aquaculture, a little bit of rock art, a little bit of insect farming. It's all over the place at the moment, and I work with a lot of different government bodies to work across these projects. That's great, but sometimes I do feel pretty tired, and I definitely, this resonates with me a lot, that you can end up feeling like you're a bit of the jack of trades and master of none. But interestingly, apparently this is a misquote, and the original quote was this: a jack of all trades is a master of none, but oftentimes better than a master of one. So that kind of made me feel a little bit better about the situation. I don't know how true that is, but I'd like to believe it's true. And I think in my case, it's definitely true, because I really do think you need to be versatile in today's climate to continue to work in research, if that is what you want to do, and engage with various industry and government partners. I also wouldn't be anywhere if I didn't have an enormous team of people that I work with, both in academia and industry. And it takes a lot of time and effort to really build these relationships, but you know, I'm not doing this by myself at all. It is a collective effort of a whole pile of people where we're pooling our skills, we're pooling our resources together. And I think being part of this collective is really what motivates me to keep working in this space. It truly is, for me, the special part of being part of a research community. Oh, I was told to talk about the challenges, and I have a few challenges to talk about. So I think maybe for the rest of the time, I'll just talk about this from the perspective of my own experience as an early career researcher, and maybe not everybody's going to have these kind of challenges. One of the things that I found is to be aware of the academic bubble that we might find ourselves in. In my own experience, that may be that oftentimes you might think that, oh, this question needs to be answered, it's the most important thing, we need money for this thing now. That's not necessarily what's seen from the other side. I think that's already been touched on. It doesn't mean that what you think is most important isn't, just because government or industry doesn't think that. I think it just comes down to compromise and maybe further discussions about why that might be important. But I think ultimately it's compromise, being able to see both sides of the coin. It's compromise is key to a long-term relationship, right? I think the other thing that's really difficult is the publishing pressures that are on academia. It's a real thing. It's pretty awful. It's so bad that there's quite a lot of cases around the world where academics are doing lots of naughty things in fraud with all sorts of citation frauds and etc. And it's, you know, the fact that people are willing to commit fraud in this area, I think, is testament to just how insane that pressure can be on some people. What that means in terms of your relationship in the projects that you might engage with is oftentimes it feels like you might be pulled in different directions, and the needs of both parties can oftentimes, I feel, be somewhat dictated by this. I have no answer on how to deal with that at all. Part of that, I think, as well, is perceived project risk. And I think we've talked about a little bit the differences between applied and fundamental research. And this is kind of what I would mean by project risk, is that oftentimes that sort of blue sky fundamental research can be seen as risky. But I think, again, it's just a matter of packaging it in the right way and being aware of the limitations of both things. how you manage this as an early career researcher is, I think you just need to have a good mentorship around you to really help you through this space, because I think it is a difficult thing to think about. I don't think it makes sense to put applied research and fundamental research in two separate rooms. I think oftentimes they cross-link, and it's recognizing those areas where they are cross-linked that's the key. Bad collaborators. I don't know if you guys have seen The Tinder Swindler, so you would understand that reference. This is kind of just, this is from my own personal experience. There's just a lot of bad apples out there. I don't know how I don't know how you spot them. Just look for the red flags, I guess, but you can waste a lot of time and energy and get really frustrated with it. So I think it is an important thing to look out for and have discussions with other people who work in this space as well, to really help you as an early career researcher who doesn't have necessarily the experience with the different people who are out there, to help you navigate that space. Avoid the Tinder swindlers. And probably the last thing that I struggle with daily is being able to value yourself, value your time, value the skills that you have. Don't under budget things and don't overpromise things. And I feel like as an early career researcher, again, that this is something that you can easily fall into because you've just spent the last 3 to 5 years on a PhD, oftentimes on a very shoestring budget, struggling through, doing a lot of overtime. There is a kind of not a culture, but there is a sort of tendency for you to want to continue almost that into the next stage of your career. And I don't think that that's sustainable in the long term. Ultimately, you have something that government want and vice versa, and you just need to make sure that you really do value yourself in that and make sure that you go to the table, don't put yourself last, and look out for yourself as well. Oh, I feel like I've just gone to a counselling session. If only I believed in those words a little bit better, I think. All right, so I'm pretty much finished. I just wanted to make it really brief. I think we're all in our own journeys. So this isn't really, you should do this, you should do that. This is honestly just the experiences that I've had. But I would say that I've learned a lot from engaging with various industry, and it's been a fantastic journey, and I hope I continue doing it. And I definitely don't want to shake hands with myself awkwardly like this ever again for a group photo. So I encourage you to go out there and don't shake hands with yourself.
Hang out here, yeah, that's fabulous. Look, again, we could listen to you all day, and it's very personal, some of this. I think. It's nice to have lovely PowerPoint diagrams, but this is actually the story of real lives, yours, people there, mine. Questions to Belinda, you've got her right here, including people online, if you want to let us know. Right at the back, please.
Hi, Belinda. Thanks for that talk. As an early career researcher myself, I saw a lot of that in my experience. And congratulations on being able to stay in research and diversifying and getting those projects. One of the big struggles I had was convincing external partners to give me bucket loads of money to keep my job effectively.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know, now that I'm in, I've moved to the Australian Institute of Marine Science. I've jumped onto the government-funded research bandwagon, which is lovely and delightful as well. But I was just wondering if you could give some words around your experience trying to attract external projects and diversify your skill sets and convince them to, or demonstrate your value to them.
Yeah, that's a good question, because I tend to. I think I feel pretty lucky during my PhD that I had people around me, including my supervisor, that was very encouraging of including me in those conversations early on before I had even graduated. So I was very much in that environment of being familiar with even like the Australian Research Council and how that whole process works. Meeting those people early on, having those connections. Throughout my PhD, I was working with people from DWER and DWER as well. So I think it was just that early on and then continuing on in that direction. The different outside of Seagrass, those new connections that I've made, I think again, it's just diversifying with through working with different people within the school here in different schools, different areas. I mean, now I work with freshwater ecologists a lot. So now I've just met, again, a different branch of people in that area. How do I convince them that I'm worth spending money on? I have no idea. I don't know. I think I'm pretty honest, I think. I really do try not to oversell things, and I really do try to see from their perspective what it is that they want. Because there's a whole pile of stuff that I would love to research that I know is of no interest to anyone except for me and maybe a bunch of other random researchers around the world. But at the end of the day, I do want to make it a meaningful thing that I'm contributing. So yeah, I think being able to empathize with their position, yeah. Did that answer the question?
Yes.
I think I rattled on a bit, but yeah.
It's an online question, thank you.
We have an online question.
Okay, I'll read it out. Great talk, Belinda, thank you. You mentioned the issue of bad collaborators and red flags. I'd be curious what your experiences have been with this and what some of those red flags are. Pray tell.
Oh gosh, I'm going to keep that very general.
Yeah.
I think it depends. Like, I think the classic case that I've experienced is having someone on and, you know, they promise you the world of what they can do and how they're going to be an X, Y, and Z person in this relationship, and then they do nothing. Yeah, that's the classic case. I think that I think heaps of people have seen. It's hard to spot. I don't know, like, it's hard to spot them. I think the problem is when, like I said, when I was an early career researcher, you don't start seeing those red flags until the contracts are already signed, and then you go, damn it, what the, oh, this person's like a dead weight now. But I think you learn from that. And I mean, I would like to stay in Western Australia. I don't want to be a postdoc that has to run around the world trying to find different jobs. I would like to continue working in the ecosystems that I know here, and I would like to continue working with the people that I work with. So I think, you know, you learn from those experiences, and you just know then to just maybe add them to your black book, yeah, and not work with those people again. But I think as well, like, I think word gets around. I think people talk, and if someone's doing something that's not great, I think it does get around a bit.
But in fairness to you,
yeah.
I mean, it's not just the experience you've had. In the last 10 or 15 years in this country, pressure on universities to publish or perish has intensified fourfold at least. The pressure on academics to raise funding for their research has increased as well. And I cannot believe that's not connected to some of this bad behavior.
Oh, it definitely is.
You made the point yourself.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I don't know how to fix it. Yeah,
but I mean, I'm just saying, but also you're working in a sector and industry, we're all working, which are quite slow to recognise and let alone solve some of those problems.
Yes, yeah, for sure. I think I did hear there was some push in, I think it might have been the University of Utrecht. I can never say that word right. Yeah, in the Netherlands. And they were trying to make tangible efforts at getting recognition for their academics that are not just reliant on the publication system and the citation system. And it's more, you know, a little bit more shifted on their outreach and their actual applications of their research, for example. And I think that's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, sure.
But the whole world needs to do that, right? Because if you're an early career researcher at that university and then you leave, you maybe don't have your track records now out of skew with everybody else.
And no university wants to go first.
Nope.
Because then you're out of line. Anyhow, that's fine. There's a question here. You've got the Chris, just.
Thanks, Belinda. Great talk. Just coming back to seagrass, which is where you sort of started off. I don't know if the statistic's right. I just sort of read it at some point, something like this, that seagrass can store or capture as much or more carbon than some of the tropical rainforests in the world in terms of sequestering carbon and putting it below the soil. So obviously, in the face of climate change and all of our efforts to combat that, seagrass is playing a massive role. Now, you've got experience in seagrass, and it's actually quite a hot topic and it's really relevant, yet you've had to diversify into the freshwater space and all these other areas. Have you, I mean, just coming back to some of the stuff that Josh was saying, you know, have you ever felt as an early career researcher that you could push the importance of seagrass and that research for carbon sequestration and all the, you know, it's important for fisheries and habitat? Or why haven't you? And you've had to diversify. And I just was interested in, you know, given all that experience and that it's so important and that still hasn't sort of happened, you've had to diversify. You know, it's strange that that's had to happen to you. And also, what if you've got any plans to go back to seagrass? And
yeah, I haven't left seagrass. I don't know if I'll ever leave seagrass. But I think, you know what, I think it's, I think Luke said, or maybe Kevin said, that the mangroves and the algal mats are an unsexy science. I think seagrass probably gets shoved into that as well. I remember on Rottnest Island once, and the bus driver was telling everyone on the tour as he's driving around, you know, oh, this is the good snorkeling spot. And it's like, don't go there, it's just full of seagrass, you don't want to swim around seagrass. And I think that's like a mentality that can exist. It is a hard topic to sell. The carbon side of things, carbon storage, obviously that's a very hot topic as well. I've never really, I've not jumped on board with a lot of the carbon sequestration side of things. I don't know. It's not, I don't know if that's been out of choice, but yeah, I think I feel like I'm advocating, I could always advocate more. But yeah, I don't know. Sometimes it just feels like people are saturated already. Yeah. And there's only so much money there. That's the feeling that I get. There's only so much money. Yeah.
Go ahead. Get the microphone at the back, please. Right,
Hi, a slightly more, I guess, philosophical question, but I'm doing my PhD, I'm doing it on something that's like kind of controversial, don't know whether it's ever going to end up with any like tangible changes. In your research and your sort of experience, how do you stay motivated to keep pushing for politicians and policymakers to listen to your science, to do things when we're consistently seeing governments making slightly dubious choices about the climate and things like that, and keep getting that sort of like knockback being like, this is the science, this is what we know is going to help things, and then people just don't seem to want to listen, or you're not talking to the right people? Like, how do you keep, yeah, that motivation to carry on going?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it is hard. I think it is hard when, you know, I showed that map of there's like 19 or so ecosystems that are showing evidence of collapse, and that is kind of like, oh god, like what do I even do about this? And it is hard, but I think, you know, I think for me personally, it's a focus on the little wins. I think I mentioned like having that good team of people that work around you, and it might be a little win, but collectively it feels great. And I know if you think in the big picture, sometimes you think, how the hell is this going to help at all? Like, I feel like this is pointless. But I think sometimes it's good to not think, while we sell our research, often we have to look at the big picture in order to really sell a story and say, hey, if this is worth funding, I'm going to save the world with this. But the reality is you're only a tiny little step in that. And I think personally, I think it's good to pull back from that on your.
By taking that shift, inevitably, you put the responsibility on a part of the world whose game is just not spend money on things that they can possibly avoid.
Belinda.
I have nothing to add except to ask that question all the time. Yeah.
Okay, fair answer. I'm on the strict instructions to land this on the deck at 2 o'clock. It's about 3 minutes to. First of all, I'm just going to take a moment to thank once more our panelists. Quick round of applause. I know we've done this before. It's been a pleasure to listen to them, a pleasure to offer a platform. I mean, I'm really grateful for the kind of connections they've made and the different perspectives they've brought. Can I also just give a quick plug to the fact that that engagement guide that Josh was mentioning in passing, I was plugging at the beginning, that is available. It is, as he was suggesting, in fact, it is subject to update. So we will go away and take certainly 1 or 2 of the case studies and put them in that. These aren't sort of tales from the front line alone. They're about making those connections about what can be done collectively by academics in order to have more policy relevance. It's more than the sum of the parts. but please feel free to connect with us, and we have an email address up there. One of the things we do at the Institute is to try to gather individual sort of challenges to see whether or not we can provide specific advice to those of you who come along to these sessions, so feel free to contact us. And then lastly, a very quick plug for 3 upcoming events. So tomorrow evening at 5:30, you can tune in and learn about the future of infrastructure in WA. That's a part of this big report that I was waving around earlier on. It's over there, WA 2050, dealing with some of the issues that fall out of this, which is about development of the state and putting communities in particular places, and therefore the environmental impact of that. On the 11th of May, we'll be launching that WA 2050 report with a large event taking place in the University Club, again at 5:30 in the evening. And then last but not least, and not surprising at all, a couple of days after the federal election, in the middle of that week, we'll be sitting down in the city at the State Theatre, again in the early evening, and we'll be talking to a panel, 2 former premiers here, a foreign policy commentator, and someone who's involved directly in the front line of trying to encourage and recruit more women to take a political career as their future, and get them to unpack the reality of what this election means. But of course, we have to wait for that election, not just us, but Josh as well. Thank you very much. Please keep in touch. But it's now exactly 10 seconds past. I just landed it. Thank you.